Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody here in the classroom, and welcome everybody joining us remotely. This is the MARESUNEX Seminar, which is led by Dr. Crowley, Dr. Elliott, and myself. I'm Peter Mullner, and it's my great pleasure to lead you through this seminar today. I give you a quick run of show. As always, we'll start with introductions of our speaker. Then our speaker will talk for 40 minutes. We'll have a 5-minute break for those in the classroom to discuss questions around their tables. For those joining us remotely, you're welcome to join a breakout room, or you might just hang out in the main room and wait a few minutes for the Q&A. And with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce Krish Vijayaraghavan, who is a principal at Ramboll, where he co-leads the firm's US Impact Assessment Group. He has over 20 years experience in environmental practice with specialization in NEPA, that's the National Environmental Policy Act, and air quality modeling. He has moderated NEPA professional training workshops in the US and led the air quality and climate impact analysis for environmental impact statements and environmental assessments for mining, energy, and transportation projects. Krish has published over 40 scientific journal articles and co-authors 2 technical books. He earned a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from the IIT in Bombay, India, a master's in chemical engineering at Kansas University, and a master's in environmental engineering from Georgia Tech. Please help me welcome Krish Vijayaraghavan.
Thank you. Thank you for those kind words. And I've got to begin by saying that I'm truly amazed by the hospitality I've received from this great institution and from Dr. Mullner, Dr. Crowley. So I'm really pleased to talk to you all. I'd like to do a couple of quick questions so people are into it. So if anybody can volunteer and say what would make this a useful or interesting session for you. Anybody want to go? Like the next an hour, you've taken an hour out of your day, you've signed up for the class. What would make it, like if you had to fast forward to an hour from now and you said, oh, that was a good one. Okay, what would make it worth your while? Any volunteers? Just a one sentence would do. Who wants to go? I'm not starting till I get a response.
Greater understanding of exceptional events.
Okay, from Zoom, a greater understanding of exceptional events. Thank you for that. I'll be talking about exceptional events in response to that question. So you get to hear what you want to hear. Okay, let me put it this way. Who wants to hear about AI in this talk? I may or may not talk about AI. Who wants to hear about AI? Okay, many raised hands. Okay, that's good. But back to the original question. I'm not looking for a technical topic. It could be something like, hey, as long as I don't fall asleep, I'm good. The more honest the answer, the more appreciative. Then I would ask you, okay, what's going to help with that? So for example, there you go. Thanks. Sorry, can you speak up, please?
Repeat the question.
Yeah, I can repeat the question, but we have a... Sorry, just give us a minute while we get a mic to you. Yeah, we got a couple of people there. Yeah, thank you.
Do not tempt me. I think I have skills that I do not have.
I would like to learn about the field that you're in and what you do for work.
Excellent. That is very helpful because I wasn't planning to talk about that, but now I will because you mentioned it. Because that's different from the scientific topic. So the question again was the field I'm working in and the type of work I do. Was there somebody out there? Are we good? Okay. Here we have one more person here.
Sorry.
Keep you on your toes. Yes.
That's a philosopher.
I just kind of want to learn about the general strategies you guys use to run the organization
Strategies
Yeah.
towards
towards the environment, like environmental protection.
environmental protection. Okay,
I didn't
good,
phrase the question, but
good one. It's a very broad question, but yeah, good question. Cool. And on perfect. And on Zoom,
11D, so given the endangerment.
oh, the endangerment finding.
Yes.
Ooh, you want me to go into tough waters, murky waters there? All right.
Yes,
Okay.
for everyone on Zoom, looking for the implications given the endangerment finding news from last week.
Okay. So endangerment finding, and then a question around what is it? We good. Strategies for environmental protection, and then the type of work we do. All good questions. Keep me honest here. If I forget any of these, just remind me. Okay. Thank you all again for attending. Now, I know this is a seminar, you got to do it anyway, but still, for me, from my perspective, you've taken an hour and a half out of your day to come and attend. That means a lot to me. So thank you. I do appreciate that. So I'm going to be talking about federal NEPA policy updates and their implications for air quality impact assessment. It's a very focused topic, and a lot of that will be about that. But I did have a small section on AI, which since several of you expressed interest, and we can talk about AI and also ethics and associated concerns, and then the questions that were raised. So that's all great. Quick show of hands before the seminar. Any of you, I mean, students, obviously not the professors, but any of you heard of NEPA before the seminar? 1, 2, maybe 2.5. No, we're good. 2, I got them. Okay, 3, 4. Hey, that's pretty good. That's pretty good percentage. Okay, 10% plus. Okay, that's a good one. So in terms of an outline, we'll first begin with the history of NEPA, what NEPA is about. Go into some detail there and see how it is really relevant to you. But what I hear is that most of you are from Idaho, to see how it's relevant to your lives outside of this seminar. We'll discuss some federal policy updates that are relevant to NEPA and some key court opinions. And then we'll segue into equality impacts. What's the relationship between, in this case, NEPA and air quality? Talk about mining sources and emissions. Dr. Molnar was kind enough to mention, war below. That's something that's of interest to you. I caught a few chapters of that, so we'll talk about that in the context of your class material and its relevance to this topic, AI, as some of you are interested. Very quickly, our company is a consulting company. Goes to the question back about the type of work we do. I'll get to that in a minute. About 18,000 folks present around the world. Very strong presence in North America, US in particular. A strong focus of the company is on sustainability. So not just talking the talk, but also walking the walk. It's owned by the Ramboll Foundation, and that's important because we're not swayed by corporate interests or, let's do something quickly to become profitable. We have many sectors across buildings, transport, energy, environment and health, water, etc. And I sit in the environment and health services. As was just mentioned, so I'm the co-lead of the America's Impact Assessment practice, the environmental impact assessment process, which you see at the bottom there. And then you see all these other aspects which deal with environment and health. So we have very strong practice. So to the question on, the type of work I do, so primarily it's environmental consulting. Is it of any interest to talk about how I kind of segued into this space? I don't know if that's so much interest, maybe. Yeah. Okay. I'll go very quick. I see a couple of heads. I bring this up because one of the professors was telling me it might be of interest. So anyway, background in chemical engineering, environmental engineering. So I'm an engineer at heart, but with a strong focus on air quality as part of my grad school. And then I, started working at a atmospheric research firm. We used to look at satellite data and its relationship with air quality. So very equality focused. And then as I started doing more of it, I realized I was particularly interested in the interplay between air quality and water, soil, the earth, human exposure, that interfacing, and that led to NEPA, as we'll see. NEPA is that summation of all of those things. So that's a kind of a 60-second summary there. In terms of the types of work we do, it's fundamentally environmental consulting. Broadly speaking, you as students, in general, there are 5 or 6 career paths, right? So you go to government, you can do academia, follow your professors, do a postdoc, etc., and get into that space, do consulting, industry, and then you have NGOs and think tanks. That's your, if anybody else think of anything else? I asked this question to others as well, but this seems to be the sum total of paths. I mean, I'm not talking about, obviously you could go into baseball and things like that, but we are sticking to your subject matter. So given that, so the space I'm in is environmental consulting, which is different from the traditional management consulting, although management consulting is related. So essentially, if you like working on diverse topics, fast-paced environment, cutting-edge topics, dealing, in my case, for example, dealing with both the public sector and private sector, you should definitely consider environmental consulting as a profession. What do you need in terms of skills? You don't need to be a subject matter expert, because that's what you learn as part of the job. But fundamental skills, if you're very good at GIS, that's one type of skill that's useful to have. If you're very good at field work, you love going out there and looking at exotic plants, cultural resources, that's one type of skill. If you're good in the lab, that's another. If you're very good at coding, Python, that sort of thing. All of those skills are helpful. And then you need some fundamental good understanding of your subject, whatever it may be. It actually doesn't matter. I gather here we have people from construction management and philosophy, and we got some EE, electrical engineering, computer science, and what else? What else did I miss? Anybody want to shout out a major that I haven't captured?
Political science.
Political science, very important. Excellent. So you got
Statistical analysis.
Statistical analysis. All right. So wide variety there. So my point is, it doesn't matter what your subject matter is, but you need to have analytical skills and critical thinking skills. Okay. So hopefully that answers that question. So what is NEPA? The National Environmental Policy Act, not the National Environmental Protection Act. Okay, there is no such act. Enacted in 1970, essentially by Nixon in response to concerns that when the feds approve large-scale projects, huge dam project, big reservoir, okay, and they're approving such projects, are they thinking about the effects of the environment more holistically, right? So federal agencies shall consider the environmental effects of their actions. That's the fundamental premise. It's procedural, not substantive, which means the process matters a lot in NEPA, doing things the right way. For example, public participation. You got to make sure that people are well informed. I was at a NEPA public meeting where you had a chief, one of the big government agencies. He's a chief or deputy chief. He was standing there. We were chatting. It was a public meeting. We had a few people come in and out. And then the meeting was set for a 3-hour duration. After 2 hours, nobody showed. But obviously, we had to wait till the end. At about 10 minutes before the end, a person rolls in, actually an older gentleman, and then had no understanding what the topic was, but was clearly interested in the project. It amazed me that this agency person, and then I realized that's how it should be done, stayed up for another extra hour because that person was a member of the public and deserved to be informed about the project. So the process is very important. And when does NEPA get triggered? Typically when it's a federal project, like you could have, like I said, the feds building a big dam, or it could be like a mining project or an energy project, a solar project, renewable energy project, other energy happening on federal lands, or there's some federal funding involved. But there are many, many exceptions to this, so it's not necessary it has to be NEPA, but these are some common reasons. So And when you look at federal lands in particular as that trigger, and you come to if you look at the map of the US and you look at federal lands. So when you say public lands, it's federal and also state, etc. So this is truly federally owned. What's the first thing that catches your attention? Just anyone, just shout it out when you look at the map. Exactly. Massive concentration in the West. And there's fascinating history behind that as well. So heavily concentrated in the West. And what that means is that chances are when you're doing a big project, infrastructure project, could be transportation, whatever it may be, renewable energy, mining, etc., chances are you're going to trigger NEPA because it's on a federal land. So on the different color codes, beginning with the top is Bureau of Indian Affairs, and then you have Bureau of Land Management, which is an important land manager in the US. In the US, there are 4 main federal land managers. What do we mean by land manager? That agency, which is responsible for administering the land and making sure that it's there for future generations to come, good mix of resource utilization and conservation. So you have the BLM, that's the color, the second color. Then the top 4 again, BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, and National Park Service. These are the top 4. And then you have all the others here, reclamation, etc. You have several agencies. If you look at Idaho in particular, now this is an interesting statistic, 62%. So over 60% of Idaho's federal land. And a lot of that is Forest Service, and then BLM is then quite a bit. And you can see that in the color coding. So the green is the National Forest, and then the yellows are Bureau of Land Management, which means when you have, again, projects, whether they be energy projects or mining projects happening on these federal lands, NEPA gets connected. So NEPA is referred to as a bedrock law or an umbrella statute, which means when you do NEPA, you have to account for the regulations associated with these other acts in some form or fashion, right? Again, going back to the fundamental prism of the premise, which is if you're the feds, imagine some federal officer sitting in some corner office with a big desk with nothing on it because all they have to do is sign paperwork, which is a pretty tough job because they're responsible for that, some big decisions. If you're that federal officer, you're signing off on something that has discretionary authority, yes or no, often then NEPA gets involved. So then you have to look at your holistic impacts, which is what the original premise of NEPA is, which means all of these other acts. So let me ask the person who's doing political science. So can you explain briefly do we have a mic? Can you explain briefly for the benefit of your colleagues or your other students, just how the 3 thing works, courts, Congress, the executive, and generally, and then statutes and laws, regulations, just go for it. Yeah.
Well, you have the legislative branch, which is Congress, which is the House of Representatives, and the Senate. They are supposed to pass laws. You have the executive branch, which is supposed to sign the laws into practice. And then you have the judicial, which is supposed to make sure they're constitutionally viable.
Okay. And what's the relationship between a statute and a regulation?
I don't think I might have a clear answer for that.
Yeah, but you pretty much covered it. I mean, the regulation is really the interpretation of it follows the act, and then the courts make sure that everything is constitutional and all that. But that was a great explanation. Thank you. So NEPA is a law NEPA is an act or a law. You got to keep that in mind. These are all on the top in the boxes. You can see Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, etc. These are all acts. An act is a law or a statute. And then at the bottom, you see other laws and ordinances, and then guidance and executive orders. So essentially, these are, in terms of the stringency, if you will, of the authority that they have, the act or a law is right on top because that pretty much dictates everything. And by the way, we are talking about the federal level, but this is also true the state level, the Idaho state legislature, obviously, similarly. And then you have regulations, which are promulgations of the act. All of this becomes important as you'll see later why I'm talking about this. And then you have guidance and then executive orders. So the NEPA process itself, there are typically 3 levels. You get to pick depending on the scale of the project. A CADEX, a categorical exclusion, is the simplest type. Very simple. These are typically predefined actions by different agencies, things that will not impact the environment much. If you're like moving your maybe it's something associated with buildings and you're doing something that's more administrative, for example. And CADEX is a vast field unto itself. The vast majority of NEPA reviews done in the US are actually categorical exclusions. Then you have an environmental assessment where you're thinking, is an action significant or not? You have to go through the process and then determine. So it's kind of mid-level. Environmental impact statement has to be done when you believe an action is going to be significant. And everything in the law has to be defined. So significance is also defined in various places. The NEPA review, as it's called, should begin at the earliest possible opportunity. So imagine you are a renewable energy developer or a mining proponent. You say, okay, there's a piece of land and there's a resource that's useful. You want to develop, but it's federal land. You go and work with the lead agency, the federal agency, to do that. Then after a careful series of steps, they begin what's called a NEPA review, which is simply a review of an analysis of the effects, potential effects from the project. And who does the review? There is a lead federal agency. So Bureau of Land Management, all the agencies will look at one of them in cooperation with other agencies and tribes. And the idea is to assess the impacts of the proposed action as well as alternatives. You want to do XYZ, then they say, hey, if you do this instead, you might avoid this environmental impact. So you want to assess those alternatives as well. As I mentioned before, there's a huge emphasis on public participation. So the typical NEPA opportunities, several of them exist for agencies and public to provide comment. So the general public and agencies can provide comment during initial scoping. Scoping is that process at the very beginning when the lead agency will put out a notice of intent. They'll say, hey, look, we're going to start this project. By the way, some of these projects could be initiated by the feds themselves, or it could be a private party. And this is the scope of the project. This is how long it's going to take. These are some of the effects we anticipate. We're going to look at it in detail. If you have any comments, please let us know. And this is meant for any member of the public. And here the public also includes agencies, tribes, etc. So, and when I say general public here, I'm talking about the public at large. And then cooperating agencies during the review of the preliminary EIS and the draft EIS. So if you can imagine a sequence of events, the very first step, you announce to the world at large, we're going to begin this. I'm using EIS as an example here, and it's the most involved one. You begin with the very first step, scoping. Seek comment. Okay, what matters to you? You as a member of the public can go, if you hear of a project, you can provide comment saying, hey, how is this going to affect my air quality, the air I breathe, or the water? Literally, you as an individual can go and provide that comment. That's during scoping. And then once the process kicks off, there's many, many stages. I've simplified it here. The preliminary EIS cooperating agencies. What are cooperating agencies? Other agencies that the lead agency works with. And likewise, working with tribes. And then again, when they review, as you get closer to the final EIS, you can review the draft final EIS. And then the lead agency also has to do government-to-government consultation with tribes. Because remember, the tribes, it's called Indian country for a reason. Okay? They're truly governments. They're not, they have much more independence than agencies. So when moving on to the policy updates that are, I did want to talk about this briefly. So back in 2023, CEQ issued what were called Phase 2 regulations, and that they had some specific provisions related to tribes in particular. For example, agencies were required to consult with tribes early, follow the tribes' procedures, because the tribes have their own kind of ancient wisdom. So you want to work with them to understand what matters to them, understand how it affects their resources and rights. And then when you look at significance, recall I talked about how when you're looking at an environmental assessment and an environmental impact statement, an EIS is always significant. That's when you're looking at it. So how do you determine if something is significant or not? I mean, if you just in general, just think of, I'm going to ask for a volunteer here. Think of any big project you've heard of. It can be anything happening in the country. How would you determine, and think of some subject that's dear to you, like, I don't know, water, okay, or any other subject. I would like a volunteer and somebody say, how do you determine if it's significant? In a very simple way. Don't worry about the science. Any volunteers? If you had to write the law or the regulation, this project is significant because why? And it's a tough question, I know. So maybe I'll give a clue. Let's say you were looking at air quality, air pollution. Then you would think, okay, wiser people than me would have determined what might be a threshold that constitutes significant, right? Like, is the air too? I mean, you run into issues where they talk about an air pollution alert when you get hit by wildfires here, right? Okay, so sometimes it's obvious, it's hitting you in the face, but sometimes it's threshold. So that would be one example, right, of significance. So in 2025, several policy updates were made to NEPA. First, in 2023, the Fiscal Responsibility Act had amendments, and NEPA hadn't been amended for a long time, and then it had amendments. And then in April 2025, the CEQ rescinded NEPA regs. This was a pretty huge development, and it actually, I'm going to go to the next slide and come back to this and explain kind of some of the things that happened in 2024 that are relevant. So two key, there were many that happened, but two key court decisions in 2024. So how many of you have taken a ride in a helicopter or aircraft over any landmark, Grand Canyon, National Park, whatever, anywhere up in the sky for, okay, go for it. Yeah, please.
Mount Denali, Alaska.
Mount Denali, Alaska. Oh, couldn't get better than that. Okay. So he's done Mount Denali, Alaska, done a tour ride. So that's what happened in Northern California, where there was a tour ride operator who was doing helicopter tours and aircraft tours. And when you do that, you have to get permission from the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, obviously. And then they have this permit issuing authority. The Audubon, whom all of you would have, or many of you would have heard about, in particular the Marine Society of Northern California, they sued the FAA on a related matter. Ignore the bullet item under that for now. Okay, sue them saying the way you granted approval wasn't appropriate. Okay, so it went through the courts, and then the court finally decided on that, but they brought in something which was totally different, but shook up the process, which is they said CEQ, essentially, I'm paraphrasing here, CEQ does not have the authority to issue regulations on a NEPA. So who is CEQ, first of all? So let's begin with something simpler, like Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. Can anybody name one agency you keep thinking of, keep hearing the news like it's federal? When you think of environmental protection, which agency do you think of? EPA, exactly, as the name implies. So EPA has regulatory authority to issue or promulgate regulations. So CEQ was that type of agency, sits in the White House, used to do that. Okay, and then in 2024, the court said CEQ never was really granted that authority. Okay, so now in April 2025, for that reason and for other reasons, the CEQ rescinded its past NEPA regulations. So, and then in July 2025, agencies issued updated NEPA regulations with the focus of with the reason being to streamline the process to make it smoother, right? And because there had been a lot of complaints about how NEPA was holding up development in many fronts, actually on both sides of the aisle at different times, whether it's conventional energy versus renewable energy, or mining or other projects, whatever they may be. So agencies issued these updated regulations, making them easier. The July 2025, the OBBBA also had amendments on NEPA. And then finally, more recently, CEQ came up with like a simplified guidance. And they said, this is how you do it. Now go and do it, get things done quickly, right? So this is happening on the policy front. On the court side, we talked about Audubon. The second one was this idea of the Chevron deference, which is traditionally deference has been given to agencies for statute interpretation. Going to what our friend who's doing political science said, the Congress enacts the laws, and then somebody has got to decide what the law means, right? And so agencies usually were given deference when there was doubt, but then, and that used to be called the Chevron deference, and now Loper Bright, this case, overturned that deference and said, no. If there's doubt, come back to the courts, okay? And then the third, and this is probably the single most, if you had to remember only one court case that was connected with NEPA, the third one, which is a 7-county infrastructure coalition, was Eagle County Supreme Court decision, went all the way up to the Supreme Court. People stood in line outside just to hear the courts, the Supreme Court justices speak on this topic. So they concluded, the court opined that you don't need to analyze any other projects other than the immediate project. So this in particular was related to a project in Utah where they were shipping some oil by rail down south to the Gulf Coast, and then it was going to be refined and various things were going to be done to it. So because it was connected, it was a federal action, NEPA had to be done. The agencies went through a pretty rigorous approach and they assessed what are the environmental effects of that railroad doing all of its activities. So what plaintiffs argued was that this is, by the way, the Supreme Court decision. I'm talking about plaintiffs at the lower court argued that no, that wasn't enough. You needed to look at how that oil was being burnt on the Gulf Coast at some refinery, look at its greenhouse gas effects and so on. So it went up the ladder, went to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court said these 2 or 3 things. Stay focused on the project, don't need to analyze other projects, especially if the agency has no legal authority over it. So now, despite these regulatory and statutory changes, NEPA is still very much applicable. You want to follow what's called the NEPA hard look doctrine for legal defensibility. It's been around a long time. If you look at NEPA case law, you would see the 2 most cited words are hard look and then arbitrary and capricious under the Administrative Procedures Act. And what does hard look mean? When you do a NEPA assessment, you need to do a careful and searching inquiry, consideration of the totality of the facts and circumstances. More recently, the regulations have made clear that, okay, you don't need to start inventing new science or go digging unreasonably. But nonetheless, the overarching thing has to be a careful inquiry. So therefore, NEPA is still very much valid as a statute. There have been some regulatory updates. It's now possible to go straight through a final environmental impact assessment. Previously, remember we talked about scoping and the notice of intent, and then you go to a draft EIS, you put it out to the public for comment. They say, I don't like this aspect, that aspect, etc. And then you come back, you revise your document, your analysis, and then you put out the final EIS. But in this case, with the more recent updates, you can go straight to the final EIS. And so the public comment happens only in the scoping period, that initial period. And then the deadline has been around for a while in some situations. You got to complete it in 2 years because for the EIS, there were instances where it was taking up to 10 years. There's a record of like 15 plus years. So things were not getting built, at least was a concern expressed by many. And then you can also adopt categorical exclusions of other agencies. That means if you are the Forest Service and you say, oh, this particular action does not require this full-blown NEPA review. You can apply a simple categorical exclusion. They have to provide the justification for that, the basis for that. But once that's agreed to, a different agency, if they're doing a similar action, they could adopt that. So, and so how is this connected to air quality? Because you still need to do the hard look, and you have these updates in federal policies, and then the court opinions still matter. So when I'm going to do a deep dive in air quality, for those who are not into this, don't worry, just get the gist of it. So you have broadly, you have every single project, broadly, this is the scope of things, right? You have criteria air pollutants, the things we breathe. I'm sure some of you have heard of ozone and SO2. PM 2.5 and PM 10 are particulates. You have lead, and then their precursors, things which form them. Hazardous air pollutants. These are things you might be more familiar with. What are also called air toxics. Benzene, chromium, mercury, etc. Greenhouse gases. I'm sure all of you have heard of them. I've listed the main ones here. There are others as well. And then what are called as air quality related values. That is not just the stuff floating around the air, but what it means to us. Like this could be visibility. I'm sure you've been to a national park or somewhere like some haze in the sky and you're not able to see clearly. Yeah. So that's visibility. Deposition is the stuff falling down to the earth, either in dry or wet conditions. So we're going to be talking about mining some more, but every project pretty much has this universe of items. And then you would essentially use data, you'd use models and literature. Literature could mean journal articles, but also gray literature, case law, existing science, etc. So this is your toolkit, impact assessment toolkit. You use data, you use models, and you use literature, which this principle you can apply to pretty much any project. Literature also includes past NEPA documents, for example. Okay. So, and then you do your NEPA analysis, which brings me to the war below, right? Which is I hear is the book your class is looking at. So the critical minerals challenge. Okay. So I put this on board. Somebody, and it's in one of your early chapters. So I'm sure somebody can speak to it. Who wants to volunteer? Just briefly, why is this a big deal? In simple words, what's the challenge, or what's going on here? Somebody want to explain by just looking at the first few chapters?
No one's allowed to leave the room to get an answer to this question. So.
And the clue is actually right there on the slide. So you could even just repeat it and put it in your context. But and yeah, somebody had a.
I was just going to say you essentially, to make the clean energy transition, you need to mine. So it kind of goes against the environmental impact you're trying to.
Speak up, put the mic close to speak up. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah, go ahead.
okay.
Yeah.
You guys can hear me now?
Yeah, now
Okay.
it's good.
Basically, to make the transition to clean energy, you need to mine, which has significant environmental impacts that you're trying to overcome.
Excellent. That he summed it up pretty well. There was one more. Is there any more? Anybody else want to comment? There is one right there.
So, according to this book, which we're reading right now, The War Below, America transiting from like petroleum to green energy, which needs lithium or critical mineral, rare earth minerals, and we are highly dependent on China. And whatever mines we have here, we export our minerals over to there, and they have low rules of environment, like we have high impact rules of environment here. So that's affecting us so much badly.
Exactly. Okay, two great points. They're actually different points, but they're related. So the first point was that to do the clean energy transition, then you need these critical minerals, but then you could have local environmental impacts. So how do you deal with that? And the second point made was, so now, and it's actually one of the discussion prompts. So I'm glad you mentioned that. So, well, you're going to have some impacts, but would you rather do it in a place where there's less impacts than maybe abroad where there's more? Okay, that's the essence of it. So it's a combination of factors, and it's had the opportunity to meet the author, and I mean he presents different sides of the story. So it's good. So when you look at how many of you have been to a mine site by any chance? Any type of mine? 1, 2, oh great. Okay, we got a few. All right. So the rest of you would be surprised to hear, maybe surprised to hear, I don't know, you tell me, that actually mine sites are pretty darn clean, actually. And the reason for that is, especially in the US, a lot of work, I'm talking from the equality perspective because that's my area. A lot of work goes into emission controls, despite having these monster trucks. I mean, these are so cool. I don't know if you've had the chance to take a picture next to one of the. So how would you've been to a mine site, so how would you rank yourself, the height of compare yourself, how tall would you be compared to this monster truck?
From northern Nevada, so gold mines out there, the tires average about 10 feet.
So you would probably reach maybe half of the tire, 1/3 of the tire. So you can imagine the size we're talking about. So, and broadly speaking, you have 3 types of sources. The stuff coming out of the tailpipe. All of you drive some kind of car, presumably, or will be. So you got stuff coming out of the tailpipe, essentially formed by combustion. You have, which is what we call as mobile as in moving, stationary, generators, crushers, pumps, etc. They're in one place, but they're burning something or crushing something, which is releasing stuff to the air. Fugitive, the word fugitive is very common in air quality. It simply means that which is not released from a specific vent or a specific stack. It's just all over. Like you kick up dust, you go running or you see a herd of buffalo and they're kicking up dust. That's fugitive because it's all over. So these are the 3 broad types of sources. And in these sources, we look at different types of pollutants. Again, remember we talked about criteria air pollutants, air toxics, and greenhouse gases. So some of you may wonder, why is ozone a pollutant? I thought ozone was a good thing. You know, the ozone hole and all that. I'm sure some of you are passionate about that. Anybody want to speak to why? Is ozone a good thing or a bad thing? And the answer to that is it depends, really, on where it is. So stratosphere, good. Troposphere, not so good. So we are talking about around us, the troposphere. So what do we do once we have this information? You quantify the emissions. Sometimes you perform air modeling. I'm talking as part of the NEPA process. You quantify GHG emissions as well. Earlier, social cost of GHGs was also characterized, not so much these days. And which brings us to wildfires. So show of hands, how many experience the wildfires of Idaho? You know, a couple of years. Yeah, well, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, there you have it, all of you, almost a lot of you. So very clear relevance to air quality, right? So the wildfires spike background air concentrations, which brings me to the question asked on Zoom in terms of exceptional event. So that's a complicated question, maybe a little bit too much for this class, but I'll explain the essence of it. So the idea is under the Clean Air Act, you have to show attainment to air quality standards. And these standards are for different pollutants like ozone, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, particulates, etc. The states have to show compliance. How do you determine if you're in compliance? You use monitors, right? Which makes sense. You measure it, and then are you in compliance? Now, you may ask, and I wondered about this a long time back, why should they care? Why would let's say a state didn't care? Obviously, there are philosophical reasons why they would care. I'm not talking about that. Strictly from a like a more day-to-day kind of perspective. One of the key reasons they lose out on federal funding, like transportation funding, et cetera. That's a key reason, apart from obvious reasons like health. So it's very important to the states to show they're either in attainment or how they're going to go towards attainment. So you have the standard for particulate matter, PM10, which is 10 microns or smaller, PM2.5, which is much smaller than the thickness of your hair. Okay, the stuff that you can breathe in. That's the second type of particulates. You have national standards for that. As a state, you have to show you're in attainment or you're progressing towards it. So imagine you're making good progress, you got emission controls, and along comes a wildfire. Boom. The whole thing, you can imagine what happens. Your entire plan goes astray, right? So there is a provision in the law where you do what's called an exceptional event demonstration, okay, where you demonstrate that, but for this exceptional event, you would be able to have shown attainment, right? Now, when it comes to other things like stratospheric intrusion, that's the other reason why you could have exceptional events. For example, a dust storm coming from far away. Okay, are you really responsible? Can you do anything about it? Not much, really. Actually, pretty much nothing. So things like that are where you would submit a formal exceptional event exclusion to EPA, and then it's up to EPA to approve or not. EPA is the one who finally decides you're in attainment, you're in non-attainment. After this class, you can go back and check, is a place you live in, is Boise in attainment or non-attainment? If it's in non-attainment, for what pollutant? This you can just do a straight up internet search or AI. I mean, you can get the answer in like 10 seconds, okay? So that's the purpose of exceptional event demonstrations, to then get an exclusion from the non-attainment status. So AI, yes or no? Should we talk about it, or should we go on to questions? Yeah, correct, exactly. So because it's all connected anyway, so we definitely want to do Q&A. How about we do this? Let's roll AI into the questions, and you can ask to the extent that I know, whatever I know, how we use it in our space, we can talk about AI there. So I think this concludes the portion of my talk. At this point, it's all Q&A. The one thing I did want to mention in the context of AI was, because some of you are philosophy students and obviously ethics matters, when you look at AI limitations and solutions, the third line out here in terms of bias and ethics. So obviously you got to be very careful when using AI. Different tools are trained on certain sets of data. They come with their own biases. And then, so one option at a more advanced level is to use your own data for training. But I would just leave you with this. And I was talking to somebody else, another student at lunch. If you're not using, this is my favorite question. How many of you use AI daily? Okay, everybody raise hands now. Only 4 people are raising hands. I would submit to you that all of you are using AI daily. You're just not aware of it. You're unintentionally using it in so many ways. Alexa, Siri, all those things are AI related anyway. So keep that in mind. But what you want to aspire to is to use AI intentionally so that you can be exceptional at your work. So let me close there, and let's move on to the Q&A. Yeah.
So wonderful. So we'll take again a few minutes of just talking about the questions that are now on the board, and which we will also share with online remotely. And those who would like to join the breakout room that will be opened right in a bit, and you can admit yourself to the breakout room. Take about 4 minutes, and then we'll reconvene here for Q&A.
Just very quickly, was there a second question on Zoom? One was exceptional events. What was the other one? Oh, the endangerment finding. Okay, very quickly, sorry, because I don't want to leave them hanging. Very quickly, the endangerment finding is what allowed EPA to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, because you have to show it endangers human health to regulate it. So essentially what's happened now is that endangerment finding has been taken back, which means you cannot regulate greenhouse gases as a Clean Air Act pollutant. And that has momentous implications, because that means once you cannot regulate GHGs, then immediately the regulations that are associated with it, whether it's your tailpipe greenhouse gases or any other regulations associated, will also be affected. So yeah, big implications. Okay, let's go back to
now we'll take 4 minutes to talk around the table about the questions that are up here, and then we'll reconvene. All right, so there is some talking going on here in the classrooms. Let's go and see who has the first question. All right, that's Matthew.
What's the typical timeline for a NEPA review?
So is that a question for me?
Yeah.
Okay, is that the way this works? I thought I get to grill them. They get to grill me? All right. All right, so what's the timeline for a typical NEPA review? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Okay, so it depends. You may notice I talked about some deadlines that are now being promulgated. So you're looking at 1 year for an environmental assessment, 2 years for an environmental impact statement. A categorical exclusion is much faster than it's the simplest process. So it could be a few months to a year to 2 years. That's the expected timeline.
Thank you.
And how does this compare to a couple of years ago?
Yeah, so several years ago, things were taking much longer. This is still very new, but in some projects, we're taking several years, 5+ years, 10 years, etc., for an EIS.
Um,
And it's could still happen. Yeah, go ahead, please.
yeah. How reliable are those air quality models when the background pollution is elevated, like for the longer period of time due to, wildfire smoke?
So I caught the air quality. No, I need that again. So
Yeah.
air quality models.
Yeah, air quality models. How much reliable are those air quality models when we know that the background pollution is elevated due to this for the longer period of time due to wildfire smoke?
Okay, so question is about air quality models, background, and wildfire impacts. So what you do in an air quality model, it'll answer part of your question, but we probably need to talk some more because it's a very deep topic. But broadly speaking, what is an air quality model? Think of it as a big box. You put in the information, and the answer you get is the air concentration that you're breathing or the deposition. Okay, so that's your framework. In that you put in information on emissions, what we've been talking about, like the last question there. And then there's information around background concentrations. Background is things that are not caused by your project, but other contributions. Wildfires play a big contributing factor to that. So one way to do that, either you exclude days where you have wildfire impacts, or you assert that, when you want to show compliance, that's probably the best way to do it, frankly, to exclude those days where wildfires have impacts. But otherwise, excluding wildfires, you do have to account for background concentrations in your model. So, okay, thanks.
Next question, please.
With the changes to the regulations regarding greenhouse gases that came out last week, is there like any projection for how that's going to go? Like, is there going to be like an explosion of greenhouse gases in the United States, or in your opinion, is it mostly going to stay at the current levels?
Yeah, that's very, very hard to predict. The IPCC does. IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. IPCC does its projections around business as usual. What if there were more anthropogenic sources, fewer, etc. So the answer is it depends. But if you wanted to get some granularity on that, you got to look at the hard data. Yeah.
Who's next? There was a lot more talking in the classroom when we had a little break. Yes.
I was a little confused when I think it was something about one of the Utah cases where it seemed like the courts now need to use or to look at each individual case as just an isolated event, and they're not allowed to look at other possible similar events that have been ruled on by courts. Is that what you said earlier?
Okay, that's a good question. So, and the reason it was unclear because I went through material pretty fast, so I understand why it might have been unclear. So the question was going back to the this third one here, right? So 7 county. So this is Supreme Court, like I said, a monumental NEPA case. So the question was, what was it about? So let me add some more to that. Previously, agencies often had to look at what are called the downstream impacts of your action. You're producing more oil and it's being shipped off to a different place. And in that place, a different agency is responsible for overseeing the burning of such oil. In this case, that's what's happening here. What the Supreme Court finally said was, you have to look at the effects of your action, and then there should be a close causal relationship with any other project that you want to analyze at the same time. So if you do not have legal authority over that project, even though that project happened downstream of your project, if that makes sense, then you don't have to look at that project inside the NEPA analysis. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah.
Going to Oklahoma and then
You talked a little bit about the how states are kind of there has to be a motivation for them to meet the air quality standards, and one of them was funding. I was curious if there are different requirements for, like, are the same requirements across states? Like, do they remain the same? Because I know geographically, like in Idaho, right, or anywhere along this side, we do tend to kind of collect all this air. And so do they stay the same? Are those considered? And on the case of wildfires, how do they overcome that? So you get a wildfire, do you, yeah, just more on that. Thank you.
Right. Two good questions related to how states show. We talked about how states would need to show attainment with the air quality standards, but then is there some geographical or sector or project consideration given to that? And then second, how do they account for wildfires? So fundamentally, this all springs from the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act, I'm getting back to basics here. Clean Air Act says you have these pollutants in the atmosphere that's bad for us, fundamentally. So then you need to maintain lower levels of these pollutants for us to enjoy our health. And so to that end, EPA promulgates regulations and they say you have to do such and such to meet these standards. Well, before that, they promulgate the standards themselves. That's a different process. So now through a advisory committee, etc. So now to the point at hand, which is what happens, and this is kind of a nuanced topic. So there are three categorizations. Those are referred to as non-attainment, attainment, and maintenance. If your region or your county is below the air quality standard and has been for a while, you're considered to be in attainment. If previously you were not, but now you are, you're called maintenance, because they're saying, okay, you're good, but let's keep an eye on you for a little bit more time to make sure you're below the standard. And then non-attainment is flat out, you're above, and you have to work towards meeting the standard. So states submit what are called state implementation plans, which work towards doing what is necessary to meet that standard. And it is in those SIP documents, in that modeling, for example, and we also support states on that. Ramboll does support states on sophisticated state implementation plans, which use advanced photochemical air quality models. And that's where you'd account for things like if there is something, because you're looking at the full spectrum of sources in the airshed, as well as what comes in from outside. So if you're looking at Idaho, then you look at not just what happens in Idaho, but what comes from outside. You look at wildfire impacts as a type of source, and then you build that model up from the ground up, evaluate it using data, and then use that model to show in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, we will get to attainment. So that's kind of the gist of how that process works. Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah. So I was gonna ask, like, carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, right? And it's the main reason for global warming. So how does it make sense to remove it from Clean Air Act?
CO2 global warming, and how does it make sense to what?
Like, how does it make sense to remove it from Clean Air Act? Like,
To exclude it, to remove it? Is that what you're saying? So, yeah, simple question, complicated answer. So, first of all, I'm not. This is an extremely complex question. I'll tell you what the history has been. The idea was you have a greenhouse gas, which goes back to the endangerment finding as well, right? The idea is if XYZ could endanger human health, it could be regulated under the Clean Air Act. Okay. CO2 has been found to not endanger human health according to this endangerment finding rescission. So I would suggest that you look at that and dive into that and see what their basis is. I mean, there's very new stuff, and yeah. So it's a nuanced answer. I mean, this is a again, like I said, a simple question but a loaded question, and yeah, I think let me leave it at that. Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah.
In your opinion, is the benefit from AI that it's having in our society worth all of the depletion of the resources and all the issues that that are being raised?
All right, great question. So let me pull up my favorite slide here. All right. So we have all of this happening in the world around us. So everybody would have heard the question, right? I don't need to repeat it, I think. Essentially, is AI worth it? Is a question. So are you asking for a personal opinion, professional opinion, or you want me to hear you out? It looks like you might already have an opinion. So why don't you speak to that?
I mean, it's very useful for like as a tutor for my like own personal use, but I don't know, I guess how much that's worth all of what everyone's saying about how destructive it is. I guess maybe both would be cool to hear your professional opinion and your personal opinion on it. I guess I don't know whether it's just a lot of just people talking about how destructive it is or whether it's actually super destructive, because if it is as destructive as people claim, then probably a personal tutor isn't the best reason to keep it around. So,
right. So first, let me begin by saying you got to be careful when using AI. As I mentioned, you have, let me go back to this slide. This is super important. You got to be cognizant of bias, ethical issues, confidentiality, accessibility, transparency. Hallucinations has become much lower. The advanced models are very low in terms of hallucinations these days. So first, you got to be careful about how you're using AI, and to the extent that you can be careful, but keeping the potential concerns of AI in mind, and while being fully cognizant of that, AI is tremendously helpful. Okay, how many of you use? Obviously, I think I saw about 5 of you use AI on a regular basis. Okay, AI once a month. No, once a week. How many of you use it? Okay, pretty much all of you. How many of you use a paid version? At least the same thing. Okay, about roughly 50-60% of the same crowd. How many of you use the best paid version? I mean, it's going to be much fewer. Okay, we got 2 or 3. So, pardon me? Oh, what is the best? So a simple rule of thumb, the thing that costs more. How about we leave it at that? Okay. So if you have like a $10 option, $20 option, $100 option, we mean the $100 option. I mean, it's almost always true in this case, in the case of AI. So the difference between the free version, the simple paid version, and the best paid version, especially between the two ends of the spectrum, you're talking about a difference of a year. So why I say that is all of you are used to AI. But what AI is doing in terms of where it is in the science and how it's helping in many ways is just so far out there, it's even beyond science fiction. That's how good it is. But 99.9% of the population is unaware. So now that movement is happening, okay? That's happening. Regardless of our conversation here, that's happening. So the question is, how do you position yourself as future adults, contributors to society? Okay, what do you do to adapt to that paradigm is how you should be reframing your question. Not as a sweeping good or bad. I mean, there's no, nothing is like ever X or Y, right? There's always different aspects to this. So you got to think of how do I adapt in this paradigm, given that only about 5 of you use it on a daily basis, but all of you say you used it once in a while, and then I pointed out that all of you are using it daily, which means you're not really using AI, you're being used by AI, or somebody else is using that. So instead, become the master of that process and start using it in any way possible. That's on the one hand. The other hand, on a practical sense, when rapid advances are made, there are always going to be issues around, the pluses and minuses of that. So you can work only within, again, your paradigm, right? Like there are people who oppose mining, and then they'll send a text message on their cell phone saying, down with mining, and then they forget this phone is almost all of it comes from mining, right? So you got to be practical, pragmatic, and work within the paradigm that you can and affect change that you want to, that you can. I mean, there's no sense in talking about like broad sweeping, I mean, not to belittle your question, that's not my intent, but I think you see what I'm getting at, right? So hopefully that helps answer the question. Yeah. I mean, the types of benefits you're getting from the health side, etc. So a lot of great things happening. Some things which people get worried about, so keep an eye on those. I'm saying be informed and stay in control of the situation. So if things go south, you're at least in control. You'll never be in control if you say AI is bad, I'm staying away from it. So there you have it.
Other questions? Over here.
And by the way, we use AI in NEPA. That's why I put up the slide inequality quite a bit. Yeah.
To kind of continue a little bit about the AI talk, it's continually growing. Data centers are getting kind of thrown around the country. It sounds like even Boise might get a data center here sooner or later. My question is NEPA kind of continuing, like making sure that in terms of regulations and policies that it's going to be kind of like how cars and such, or I guess apart from last week, they all have regulations and they all kind of have their own stuff. Is it going to be the same with AI, and are they keeping up with it, with how much water they use, including resources, to make sure that they're not going to kind of constrain the city in terms of energy usage?
Yeah, good question. So let's go to my umbrella slide. Okay. So NEPA, the first thing, essentially the question was data centers and NEPA and, are things being managed well? Essentially, that was the gist of it. NEPA has to be triggered for NEPA to play a role. So recall the NEPA triggers, you got to be on federal land, it's got to be some federal funding, federal action of some kind of if everything else, you forget everything else, just remember that one person who's got this big table, totally clean, and then all that person does is sign off, yes or no on projects, right? Fictitious person, of course. So you need that kind of discretionary approval for NEPA to happen. If that happens, yes, then immediately NEPA plays a role in data centers. Yes. Often it need not happen because the project need not meet those criteria. But then you also have these other things here. I put them in the context of NEPA, but individually you can remove the umbrella. All of these are enacted laws, okay? And projects do have to follow them. And so Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act. If you have wetlands, you're dredging into waters. If you're having equality effects, all of these things, you have to follow the law. So short answer, yes, because of those reasons. Yeah.
Wonderful. Maybe if one more chance, if anybody is anything in the chat? No. Let's give another round of applause for Krish Vijayaraghavan.
Thank you. Thanks again. And this has been great. Appreciate you, all of you taking the time. If you're looking for jobs, look at our webpage and look for careers and enjoy. Thanks.